Y'all all got really quiet. Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? My name is Pamela Anthony, and I am the Dean of Students here at Iowa State. And I am so honored to welcome you all to tonight's lecture. The 2014 Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Series has provided us several opportunities to discuss Dr. Martin Luther King and his vision and his legacy. And tonight is another event in our series. And as the chair of the Martin Luther King Holiday Planning Committee here at Iowa State, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. We have one more event following tonight's event next week in celebration of our Legacy Series, and that is on Monday, February the 3rd at 7 in the South Ballroom. We will host the Freedom Riders documentary and discussion, so I hope that you all will plan to attend. The Legacy Series could not be possible without our numerous sponsors, so I would like to take this time to recognize and thank our sponsors for their contributions. The Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Planning Committee, the Colleges of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Business, Design, Human Sciences, Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Veterinary Medicine, the Department of History, Athletics, the Dean of Students Office, the Women's and Gender Studies Program, the Black Graduate Student Association, the Office of the Senior Vice President and Provost, Office of the President, the YWCA Ames, the George Gund Lecture Fund, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by GSB. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a reception and book signing, so I hope that you all will stay for the duration of our program. At this time, I would like to welcome Aja Holmes, who will introduce our illustrious speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Dean Anthony. Hello, my name is Aja Holmes. I am a doctoral candidate in the School of Education and also the co-chair on Committee on Lectures. And it is my very special honor to introduce our guest tonight, the Edwards Professor of American History Emerita at Princeton University and author of The History of White People. Her books also include Creating Black Americans, Southern History Across the Color Line. She earned her doctorate in history from Harvard University and also held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowments for the Humanities, and the Council for the Learned Societies, and the American Antiquarian Society. She has served as the president of the Organization of the American Historians and the Southern Historical Association. So please join me and give a warm welcome to Professor Nell Irving Painter.
Hello. Thank you very much, Aja. And can you hear me? Is this working all right? In the right place? My lecture this evening is a question. Can a black scholar write about white people? But before I start answering that question, I want to thank the students and the faculty of the Martin Luther King Jr. Planning Committee for inviting me to speak and for all of you for coming. My topic isn't directly associated with Martin Luther King Jr. We think of him in terms of our citizenship, of human rights, of economic equity, many important aspects of our national life, but not so much about culture and about the kind of question I'm going to address this evening. But I think that asking a question about scholarship extends what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. And perhaps if he were with us today, he might be addressing this kind of question as well. Now, my question, can a black scholar write about white people? You may know that in 2010, I published a highly successful book entitled The History of White People. And you are jumping to the conclusion now that the answer to my question is yes. Are you not? How many are saying yes? How many are saying no? How many know it's a trick question? So, yes, it is a trick question. Obviously, I wrote the book. I have a black body, female too. So we can all pack up and go home. No. Sit down, stay. To capture the full complexity of this question, we need to attach some further questions as corollaries. 3. 1. Can anyone write about white people? 2. Can a black scholar write about black people as individuals? And 3. Can we get to a place in which racial identity is not the main thing we need to know about an author? So 3 additional questions. Now, in the first question, when I say, can anyone write about white people, I don't mean writing as though people are just assumed to be white, that white is unstated default assumption. That's just about everything you read. I mean people labeled as white people, not just people. Can anyone write about white people as raced, just as black people are raced? Therein lies the rub, and that goes against much of the American grain. Whiteness is supposed to be invisible, normal, not raced, not classed, so that race is somebody else's problem. White means middle class, well-meaning, hardworking, honest, upstanding. Any of you remember back in 2008 when Hillary Clinton let go of that line about honest, hardworking white people? Any of you remember that? That was such a long time ago. I shouldn't ask you about 2008, should I? But that is a kind of statement of what most of us kind of assume, that white people are the American normal, with traits so normal as to be invisible. The opposite of those excellent normal traits are assumed to belong to other people, very often assumed to belong to black people. So the taken for granted image of black people embodies the traits associated with poverty, such as ugliness, sloth, crime, dirt, illegitimacy, and bad child rearing generally. Now, within these stereotypes, if we want to modify the ideas, we have to modify our language. So if you want to talk about white people with unlovely traits, you have to use an adjective or two, like poor or trashy. And if you want to talk about black people who are educated or prosperous or thrifty, then you need also to attach adjectives such as middle class or nice. Mostly we use this kind of language without stopping to think about it, so that if you want to look at literature or art that deals with the experiences of living in poverty, for instance, then you go to African American studies. Because there's a class dimension within race talk. The expectation is that all white people are automatically middle class and genteel. That attracts many people who want to talk about other people, no matter what their race is, to black studies. So we very often go to black studies if we want to find stories of people who learn to speak standard English, people who learn to make small talk, people who learn to control their angry outburst, or moving between the different worlds of college and home, or college and the neighborhood, of well-dressed colleagues and shabby homies, of success contrasted with violent death. So much in our culture would incise color lines deeper and deeper and deeper to make those dichotomies as sharp as possible. But in our actual various personal experiences, you all know that the old neighborhood can be black or non-black, that it can be immigrant as well as native, that the colleagues who are crowned with success can be black, can be white, can be Latino, can be Asian. We also know that drug addiction and lethal overdoses carry away people of all races, even though the iconography of our society increasingly colors pathology black. So this brings up the second question. Can a black scholar write about black people as just people? I don't mean harping on racial differences. I mean not going there first. I'm not saying that race disappears, because in everyday life in a racist society, race does affect everyday experience. I don't mean ignoring race. I mean seeing commonality as well as difference, seeing what we share as well as what sets us apart. I don't mean pretending that there's no such thing as black history or the black diaspora or even black movie stars and celebrities and a president who was reelected to a second term. These things are all real and they're all important, but they're not all there is to individual experience. What I do mean is not starting and stopping with racial difference. It can be done. I did it. In Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, for instance, my biography of Sojourner Truth. And that biography contrasts the racial symbol of Sojourner Truth with the life she actually lived. In answer to my third question, can we get to a place in which racial identity is not the main thing we need to know about an author? Here I want to share something of my experience in writing The History of White People. That is my book entitled The History of White People. Those of you who have read the book or seen the book, you know that it's long and it's scholarly with hundreds of pages of endnotes in 3 languages. The book took 10 years to research and write, and I dedicated it to the Princeton Library. It's a book of scholarship that I believe should be judged according to the soundness of its scholarship and the grace of its prose. Similarly, the classes that I offered at Princeton should be judged according to intellectual standards. But when I started my research in the early 2000s, these were not the questions confronting my students as they traveled back and forth between Princeton and home. Now, those of you who are faculty will recognize the pattern of teaching a class about something you're writing as a way of working through the questions and answers. So that's what I was doing. I taught the history of white people at Princeton 3 times as an undergraduate class and once as a graduate seminar. Students here at Iowa State University probably treat the books that your professors assign you as Princeton students do. You carry them around with you, you take them home, you read them, I don't know where you read them. From the very first undergraduate class, my students would return from break with stories about their families' questions about this popular class. Parents, especially, ask more urgently about my race as the professor than the content of what students were reading and discussing. Early on, it seemed as though the racial identity of the professor determined what parents thought of the class. In the early days, too, I would get similar responses from people curious about what I was working on. They'd say, "What are you working on now?" I'd say, "Oh, the history of white people." In the beginning, I could practically make a taxonomy of the responses. The thought that an African American author would be writing about white people after the long, long history of white people writing about black people, this delighted many African Americans. It also delighted many non-black people who considered themselves the allies of black people, and for the same reason. People with European immigration in their family backgrounds would remember stories like this of categorization, stories of grandparents who considered themselves Jews or Italians or Irish, who thought of themselves as white, but who might also be abused by other white people over their religion or where they came from. A lot of my questioners said they very much look forward to reading my book. But in those early days of the century, some white people, on hearing my topic, would draw back from me and ask if I were writing as a black person. And I think they meant, was I going to get back at them for all the terrible things that white people had done to others? At first, I would pull myself up self-righteously and say, I'm writing as a historian. And then, tiring of that answer, I'd ask, what are my options? By about 2005, I was about ready to say I was writing as a white man. But before I could use that line, the question stopped coming. At least it stopped coming to me. Skeptics, to me, stopped expecting my book to work as a cudgel and started expressing curiosity as to what I would find. Now, I understand that evidently there are some reviews of the history of white people on Amazon.com that can be pretty tough and accuse me of writing revenge history. I don't read them. I'm chicken. I don't want to read things that are not going to make me that are going to make my stomach ache. Overall, the book's reception has pleased me greatly. The New York Times Book Review reviewed it positively in a front-page review, which put my book on the bestsellers list in hardcover. I was invited, even better, on the Colbert Report. See? That's interesting. Front page, New York Times Book Review. Colbert Report. Yay! Yeah. So Stephen Colbert and I arm wrestled over whether there was a biological difference between the Catholic Irish and the Scots Irish. So I gave lots of interviews, and I appeared at the National Book Festival on the Mall in Washington and the Miami Book Fair. I did this during my first year of graduate study at the Rhode Island School of Design, so that was an interesting year. So all in all, I would say that that was a resounding vote of confidence for a positive answer that we started with. Can a black scholar write about white people? Well, yes. My book came out in March 2010, which is 4 years ago. And my American audiences have taught me three things I want to share with you. The first regards the U.S. Census. The second regards a common misperception about the number of white races. And this misperception, it exists even among people who have read my book. The third concerns the common American equation of race with black people. So for the first, The History of White People, the book, came out in a census year, that is 2010. And you may recall the brouhaha over President Obama's marking the black box on his census return. Any of you remember that? Put your hand up if you remember that. Okay, not so many, yeah. You know, in the census has become more and more complicated over time. You know, the census questions change every 10 years. The census isn't some kind of freestanding repository of biological truth. It's political. And so, for instance, if you wanted to get a race called Iowa State University, you would all march down to Washington and you would pressure your senators and your congressmen or people, your congresspeople, and say, we want a race called Iowa State University. And if you were persistent enough and persuasive enough, that's how you would do it. That's how the Hawaiians got theirs. They wanted a race called Hawaiians, and they marched, well, you can't march from Hawaii to D.C., but they lobbied, and they got a new classification. So every 10 years, you can look at the questions to find out what's on at least the government's mind about what they need to know about the American populace. So, for instance, in the first census in 1790, only one race was mentioned, and that was white, and that was to distinguish between white people who were free and white people who were not free. And then we needed something a little more elaborate than that. By the middle of the century, the 19th century, the census was asking what country you were born in and what country your parents were born in. And that continued right down into the 20th century, because during those decades, European immigration was a big political issue. European immigration was cut off in the mid-1920s, and so by the 50s or so, the 1950s or so, most Americans of all backgrounds were American-born of American parents, or at least American-born. And where your parents came from in Europe was not a big deal. So those questions were no longer asked. 1965, a change in immigration policy meant that we now had larger numbers of Asians and Latinos coming to the United States. So the questions were massaged so that we could count up Asian people and Latinos. Now, the problem came up with what race are Latinos? Well, in Texas, the Texas population descended from Mexicans had gone to the Texas Supreme Court to have themselves declared white. So in Texas, if you're Mexican American, you are a white person. But if you go over to another state, that doesn't necessarily go with you. So it had to be decided kind of on a case-by-case basis. This was very cumbersome. Meanwhile, Latinos did not want to be classified by race. Large numbers of Latinos did not want to. So then in 2000, we got Latinos, asterisk, can be of any race. And then we also got, you can be of more than one race. So 2000 started this flowering of categories in the U.S. Census. So by 2010, you had to answer two kinds of questions. You didn't have to if you didn't want to. But if you wanted to, you had to be a race and you had to be an ethnicity. And the races were getting to be infinite. And the ethnicities were very complicated. And this is producing, as we speak, a taxonomical meltdown of the U.S. Census. But I get ahead of myself. Okay. So the history of white people came out during a census year. And the census was on the minds of many people in my audiences. And one of the questions that came up sometimes was about President Obama's. Did I approve of President Obama's checking the black box. Sure. One of the great things about how we decide in the census is you get to decide. In the 19th century, the leading figure in your town or your neighborhood would go around and check you out and decide where you were. And that meant that you could change from one census to another. Now you can decide yourself. But it wasn't so much what Obama was. Most of the uneasiness came from people who felt that they should check the white box, and they were squeamish about that. So I would listen to their concerns. Some of them were ethnic, some of them were historical, some of them were political, and I came up with an answer. I said they should check the black box because we need more black people. Okay, the second issue has to do with the number of white races. If you have read my book, you know that it has a fundamental lesson. Things change. Things change. Since the middle of the 18th century, when scientists invented human races and started classifying them, the numbers of races and the numbers of white or European races have constantly changed. Scientists have never agreed on the number of races or the number of white races. Scientists have never agreed on what it is you need to measure to decide how to classify or how to count up the number of races. Some people do heads, some people do shapes, some people do bodies, some people do height, some people do whether you have an oval face or not. So what you decide, what are the criteria? Almost you can make them up because there's so many. There has never been agreement on what you need to measure. From the 18th century until well into the 20th century, racial science and ordinary people recognized more than one white race. In the middle of the 19th century, Catholic Irish were considered white. Adult Irishmen, Irish American men could vote. And the vote profoundly shaped the experience of Irish immigrants and their descendants in the United States. They could become a voting bloc, and they could have influence in a democratic society, and they had access to patronage jobs such as police and teachers. So it wasn't a question of the Irish becoming white. They were already white. But during the 19th century, while Irish men were voting as white men, they were also thought to belong to an inferior white race, the Celtic. In the early 20th century, however, people called Eastern European Hebrews were classified as a separate, inferior, but a white race. Slavs belonged to an inferior white race. Northern Italians belonged to an inferior Northern Italian race, which was white. Southern Italians belonged to a Southern Italian race, which was white. Sometimes they might be considered dingy white, but they were considered white. In the early 20th century, Irish Americans who 50 years earlier had been an inferior white race got elevated into a new category. The new category was Nordic. And Nordic included Ireland as well as England and Germany. So it was Northwestern Europeans. So we got a new race, a better race, Nordic. Things change. The prevailing notion of one big white race with no internal distinctions is a product of the mid-20th century, the 1940s to be exact. In the early 20th century, as I said, scientists routinely denoted several white races, all white, but of varying capacities and virtues and defects. In the 1930s, German National Socialism, the Nazis, their anti-Semitism, which made Jews into a race and turned murderous, got Americans to thinking that it was not such a good idea to have several white races. So anthropologists gave us the orthodoxy that we still recognize today. This is the 1940s. There are only 3 real races. One is Caucasoid, one is Mongoloid, and one is Negroid. You can tell they're scientific because they end in oid. And in that order. Now, let's go back to immigration and changes. By the 1970s, the term ethnic superseded race for various white groups. So by the 1970s, it was thought there's just one big white race, but within it, there are several ethnicities, but one big white race. And we think in the shadow of that kind of a classification. That kind of classification is under considerable stress in the United States. One, as I mentioned, is Hispanics, Latinos, who can be of any race. The second also comes from immigration, this time from people of African descent. In the 20th century, virtually all Black Americans were native-born of native parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. So if you ask someone in my parents' generation, what was our ethnicity, they would say Negro. But now, Caribbean immigration has altered the landscape of places like my New Jersey, New York, and Florida. But in addition, people from Africa are here in visible numbers. By the middle of the 1990s, more Africans had come to the United States voluntarily than had been shipped involuntarily during the Atlantic slave trade that peaked in the 18th century. So we have more African people here who are immigrants than we had in the 20th century. And many African immigrants are very well educated. Soon the census will need ethnic categories within Black. I want to close with an observation arising from discussions around my book, which I remind you is entitled The History of White People. My observation concerns the common American equation of race with Black people, or I should say, Americans' fascination with Black people. Does anybody have a copy of The History of White People that you could just hold up? Would you hold it up? Let people see how fat it is. That's a big, fat book. Thank you, Aja. So this book devotes hundreds of pages to the construction of white identity. But invariably in question and answer sessions following my talks, questioners would ask about Black people. Even though I had spoken about the long-standing slave trade from Eastern Europe, the Black Sea trade, into the Mediterranean, questioners would want to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, and they wanted to talk about it in racial terms, as though slavery could only concern Africa and people of African descent. I maintain that slave trades anywhere, whether around the Black Sea or the Atlantic Ocean, should be analyzed as business history, not as race history. Questioners of a stereotypical mindset would want to know about Black crime. And in 2010, everybody wanted to talk about President Obama. I conclude that for many Americans, black people are much more interesting than white people. I want to leave you with two things I know now. First, black scholars can write about anybody as long as they do their scholarly homework. And anybody can write about anybody as long as they do their scholarly homework. Second, things change, and the ways we think about race, or even think of race as a useful category, that also changes. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Dr. Nell Painter for her lovely lecture. And we are taking questions as well. And we have a mic. I'll kind of work the front area or this side, and you can take that side. So we do have a microphone for questions.
Hi, I'm Key.
Hi, Kay.
I wanted to know, during your research, what would you say was the hardest part of trying to get the research done as well as write the book and kind of get everything that you needed to complete or paint a complete story?
The hardest part was going to art school at the same time. But I had a lot of support. I had an advance contract, so I knew the book was going to appear. I broke the back of it, actually, before I went to graduate school, so that was good. And I would work during the summer, so I would load up my car with all my books and stuff and go up to the Adirondacks and just work really, really hard. The two things that made it, I won't say easy, it was not, it's a big book with a lot of work in it, but I don't think I could have done it without I dedicated the book to the Princeton Library, and the Princeton Library was absolutely essential, and distance access, through the internet was absolutely essential. And Wikipedia and Google were helpful too.
Mexican, and mother was Iowan. Another one whose father is African American, but his father was African American and his mother was German. So they can declare whatever race they want to, but
Yes.
How valuable is it? So what?
So why?
So what?
So what? I think that's a really good answer. So what? Because that in our lives, that's how we need to go about dealing with people as individual people. But as I said, the census does not pretend to give you some freestanding scientific knowledge. The census is a political document for political purposes, and those are the purposes it serves. So, but the situation that you're describing, I've heard this over and over and over again, and that's why I say that the census is facing taxonomical breakdown.
Hello, my name is Christian. I was wondering, what were the pressures or the factors behind you wanting to actually write the book? Was it the question, can a black scholar write about white people, or what were the other things that came about the book?
Let's see. The History of White People is my 5th authored book. So the book I did just before that was actually History of Black People. And before that was Southern History Across the Color Line, which is Southerners of different sorts. I have done 2 Penguin Classics, one Narrative of Sojourner Truth, one Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and then I did some other books before that. So I could do whatever I want. And you're too young to remember this. I mean, you guys didn't even remember 2008. But back in the 20th century, when I was thinking about this, at the turn of the century, the Russians were, as the Russians are always fighting the Caucasians. They're always trying to control the Caucasians. And right now, Sochi, Caucasus, and all of the quote-unquote terrorism around Sochi has to do with Russian imperialism dealing with the Caucasus. So the turn of the 20th, does anybody remember this? The Russians bombing Grozny, bombed out Grozny. You and I remember it. Take my word for it, the rest of you. Oh, somebody else remembers too. Good. So I'm reading the newspaper and looking at the front page of the New York Times, and here's bombed out Grozny, and all this talk about the Caucasus. Grozny is Chechnya. And I'm thinking, why are white Americans called Chechens? That's where it started. Why do we have this word that comes from this place that's been embroiled with the Russians for such a long time? And so that's how the book got started. And, you ask one question, you find an answer, and then, of course, that brings up, you know how this goes, it brings up other questions and so on. And before you know it, you've got 500 pages.
Hi. I read your book, Exodusters, for a graduate seminar class, and I was wondering, how do you think your approach to scholarship has changed since then? Or if it has changed, or if you have any tips for maybe future faculty, hopefully?
Sure. The tips is easy. How to write a successful dissertation?
Yes,
Take a big question in a small place and ask a question that anybody here will recognize. You don't have to explain the question. So for historians, if you take something that historians have pawed over ad nauseum, but 2 generations back, then you can do it fresh. But, and don't try to do comparative history. Okay. Now, yeah, it's changed. It's changed. And part of it is like with Christian's question, when I did, Exodusters was my dissertation. The narrative of Hosea Hudson was something I just wanted to do. Standing in Armageddon was a book I was asked to do. Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, that again started with a question. So Sojourner Truth, the 19th century Black American feminist abolitionist, if you go to women's studies offices, you would see photographs, you would see posters of Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth in the posters looks like this. But if you ask people, what does Sojourner Truth say? I'm a woman! What's going on here? And so that's how we got to Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol. I could ask questions. So I was very lucky in the sense that my parents were always very supportive, and I always felt that, like the country music singer said, take this job and shove it. I could do that if I wanted to, or at least I thought I could for a while. I discovered after I had tenure and a full professorship that it wasn't that easy. But I was, I always felt free to do whatever I wanted to do. And that's a help as well. So, I just sort of wandered around. I never had a plan until I started going to art school. Then I had a plan.
When and where do you
Where are
think
you?
we should...
Where are you?
Oh.
I'm right here.
Ah, okay.
When and where do you think we should look, if ever, at race history and other racialized information?
Wherever you want.
Where do you think we should look at?
No,
Like,
no, wherever you want.
What? Oh, where? Okay.
Wherever you want. Just keep looking. Don't stop with an easy answer. Don't stop with just what other people want you to see. And the more you look, the better.
Dr. Painter, thanks. Are you optimistic about a future of the dissolution or disintegration of racial bigotry and racial prejudice, and why?
Yes, no. I'm optimistic generally. Already with the dismantling of the laws of segregation, are they seeing you? Yeah. We have someone here too. Okay, just 1 second. Already in the 60s, the 1960s, with the dismantling of the laws buttressing white supremacy, things started changing. And over the generations, you know, I said at the end of the history of white people that, that being white isn't what it used to be. You know, we have rich black people and beautiful black people, and the president is a black person. You know, so it's not like it was in the 20th century. But I also believe that whatever takes its place will be worse. So, yeah, that might go away, but what's coming next? But on the other hand, it'll be better.
Hey, yeah, I was just wondering how you fit such a broad topic into one book.
Okay. All right. Give it up for Ames High School back here. Woo!
I believe the French census does not list individuals by race.
That's right.
And I thought it might be interesting to have your commentary on other countries that don't distinguish by race versus countries that try, like Brazil and the U.S.
Yeah, I am not qualified really to speak on other countries in this respect, but I do know a bit about France. And they have been trying to figure out ways to deal with inequality. And they have talked about adopting race. Maybe that's one way to do it. But if you're talking about inequality, you know, you could just talk about inequality. If I were running the census, which obviously I'm not, I would want to know about family income and family wealth. Right now, you can find that information if you hunt and hunt and hunt. Sometimes you have to use proxies, but we are not so good at finding out what people have.
This is not really a question, but more of a comment, but I guess kind of a way to highlight what you said about the complications of race and ethnicity in the modern times. If you look at the Trayvon Martin situation with George Zimmerman, people were trying to like classify him so they could try and get out of the, whether it's a racial issue or not. Yeah. So he's Latino, but is he he's Jewish or is he white? Is he just Latino? How does he classify? And how he classifies, does that make what happened a racial thing or not? So that was just kind of a highlight of
what do you think?
You said. What do you mean in regards
what
to
do
what?
What do you think?
Like whether he's white, Jewish, Latino?
Does it matter?
No, I don't. I mean, it kind of. Yeah, I said it does matter, because the issue of stereotyping young black males as violent is very prevalent, not only in media. So, by having that issue arise, you're showing that it's something greater, and it's still a big issue today. So. To try and brush it aside and say, well, that wasn't a main motivator or something like that is kind of minimizing something that's greater?
I agree with you in your larger statement, but I don't think typing Zimmerman is the way to get to it.
Well, I wasn't necessarily saying typing him. I'm just saying that the issue itself brings light to that because that was a kind of essential thing in the entire ordeal.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And it was clear from just the statement of the facts of the case that what was going on had to do with stereotyping Trayvon Martin. So that's all we need to know. And, you know, I live in a city that's majority black, and there are plenty of black people who hold stereotypical ideas about black people. That, you know, the biggest bigot I ever knew was my own aunt. But so it's not about the person who holds the stereotype or the bigotry, but rather what is circulating in society that gives credence to that kind of stereotype.
Can you say something about the census? That is to say, the utility of the census or the meaning of the census, either really or symbolically?
More than what I said?
Yeah, I mean, how is the information used in a political sense in which all this matters?
Okay, I said a lot about that already, but I'm going to say one more thing about how is the information used, because you might find it interesting. You know, you're saying this thing is going to break down because everybody's all mixed up and, you know, it's too hard and what are you using it for and so on and so forth. The people who want us to keep race are the people who support black civil rights and black economic rights, because the census is used to channel money into black neighborhoods. So, you know, if you ask me as someone who's standing up here who's not particularly influential, do I think we should do away with racial classification? And you don't let me go to politics and economics, I would say sure. But given the politics and economics and the way they stack up in our country at this time, we still need it. It's going to be a mess, and it's going to fall apart by itself.
I haven't read your book, so I'm kind of...
You were going to ask me a dumb question, aren't you?
Yeah. I came here thinking you were going to talk about the history of white people, and so I was just wondering, what are some of the main points that are in your book?
I'm not going to tell you. You read the book.
1795.
But I will tell you this, and I told you this already, I'll tell you again. The main lesson is that things change.
It's okay, honey.
One more question.
All right, Dr. Kroom, yes.
I actually have two questions. The first one is really quick, though.
Okay, one more questioner.
Right. So, Kim, you started by suggesting that black scholars can write about people as long as it submits to some scholarly idea.
And I added that anybody can.
Right.
Yes.
So I'm curious, because somebody else asked this, but can black scholars actually write about white people before tenure as we know it today and be successful in that process?
Yes.
You did that before? Okay.
Yes.
Just checking. And then the other question I have actually is about, and it's more of a clarifying question. So are you suggesting that we can talk about inequality without talking about race?
No.
No.
And I said that.
Okay.
I said that really clearly.
Okay. Sorry. Some other people just said really, so that's why I wanted to get clarity, because I didn't hear that, but I wanted to make sure that that's not what's.
I am not saying race doesn't count. I'm not saying we don't look at it. I am saying it is not the only thing we look at and the last and first thing we look at. It's part of our culture, it's part of our history, but it's not all there is.
Let's give her another round of
Thank
applause.
You.
Please join us in the back for a reception, and at that time you can also ask her questions as she is signing the book. And please pick up a Women Impacting ISU poster on your way out, hanging in your room, on your wall, in your kitchen.